recently got an SRK in 3V from Cold Steel. Watching and reading through several reviews, it seems the people have spoken, designating the sheath that comes with the knife as a bad piece of equipment. Looking up sheath builds on YouTube, I saw only a couple of hybrid Kydex leather contraption that I thought were rather unappealing. So I made a video of a full build of a leather dangle style sheath for you to follow or get inspiration from. First was determining the style. I was unsure if I wanted to hip carry, dangle, or scout carry. From further inspecting the knife, I decided a dangle would be the best option regarding the lack of rigidity in the guard, or else I would have opted for compression fit scout carry. The most important details in leatherwork are in the layout, and the same could be said about several other craft works. Making templates and patterns on something fairly rigid like cardstock is most ideal as it can be easily stored for a future build. With any layout, we begin with a line. This line for this build will now represent the spine of the knife. Place the knife as square as possible to the line and trace it. I go over important elements in ink to preserve them when I start designing other parts in pencil. I design on the fly, so there are times when an eraser are necessary. For this build, I am going to use a 1/2 inch or 12mm welt, which is easily scribed with a transparent ruler. The welt for this build will be continuous around the entire blade. With the welt established, now one has the liberty to doodle and explore, which is exactly what I am doing here. I am establishing lines and trying to manifest shapes into a design that fits my fancy. Take some time and explore different shapes. This isn't going to define the sheath, but just give it pathway of direction. Now I am determining the center of the blade. This is an important detail. This center line will help us perform layout for other parts on the sheath later on. I want to note that even though all these details are going down on one sheet of paper, one has to think in layers. With a separate sheet of paper, I am tracing the portion of the sheath I intend to fold for my dangler loop connection. You will see me alter this as I go forward, ultimately changing the shape to fit a D-ring, and I later decide to extend this portion of the sheath.
Gardening Without Irrigation, or Without Much anyway, by Steve Solomon. Chapter 2, Water-Wise Gardening Science. Plants are water. Like all other carbon-based life forms on Earth, plants conduct their chemical processes in a water solution. Every substance that plants transport is dissolved in water. When insoluble starches and oils are required for plant energy, enzymes change them back into water-soluble sugars for movement to other locations. Even cellulose and lignin, insoluble structural materials that plants cannot convert back into soluble materials, are made from molecules that once were in solution. Water is so essential that when a plant can no longer absorb as much water as it is losing, it wilts in self-defense. The drooping leaves transpire, evaporate, less moisture because the sun glances off them. Some weeds can wilt temporarily and resume vigorous growth as soon as their water balance is restored. But most vegetable species aren't as tough. Moisture-stressed vegetables may survive, but once stressed, the quality of their yield usually drops markedly. Yet in deep open soil west of the Cascades, most vegetable species may be grown quite successfully with very little or no supplementary irrigation and without mulching, because they're capable of being supplied entirely by water already stored in the soil. Soil's water holding capacity. Soil is capable of holding on to quite a bit of water, mostly by adhesion. For example, I'm sure that at one time or another you have picked up a wet stone from a river or by the sea. A thin film of water clings to its surface. This is adhesion. The more surface area there is, the greater the amount of moisture that can be held by adhesion. If we crushed that stone into dust, we would greatly increase the amount of water that could adhere to the original material. Clay particles, it should be noted, are so small that clay's ability to hold water is not as great as its mathematically computed surface area would indicate. Surface area of 1 gram of soil particles. Particle type, very coarse sand. Diameter of particles in millimeters, 2.00 to 1.00. Number of particles per gram, 90. Surface area in square feet centimeters, 11. Particle type, coarse sand. Diameter of particles, 1.00 to 0.50. Number of particles, 720. Surface area, 23. Particle type, medium sand. Diameter of particles, 0.50 to 0.25. Number of particles, 5,700. Surface area, 45. Particle type, fine sand. Diameter of particles, 0.25 to 0.10. Number of particles, 46,000. Surface area, 91. Particle type, very fine sand. Diameter of particles, 0.10 to 0.05. Number of particles, 772,000. Surface area, 227. Particle type, silt. Diameter of particles, 0.05 to 0.002. Number of particles, 5,776,000. Surface area, 454. Particle type, clay. Diameter of particles, below 0.002.
Once I felt satisfied in my design, I cut out the template. I want to reiterate that the process of layout is the most important part of the craft. Don't skip on the small details and perform with accuracy. This template of a sheath is to be traced and cut out a second time.
Surface area, 454. Particle type, clay. Diameter of particles, below 0.002. Number of particles, 90,260,853,000. Surface area, 8 billion. Source, Foth, Henry D. Fundamentals of Soil Science, 8th edition, New York, John Wiley & Sons, 1990. This direct relationship between particle size, surface area, and water holding capacity is so essential to understanding plant growth that the surface areas presented by various sizes of soil particles have been calculated. Soils are not composed of a single size of particle. If the mix is primarily sand, we call it a sandy soil. If the mix is primarily clay, we call it a clay soil. If the soil is a relatively equal mix of all three,
We need a second because the first template will continue to be cut for parts, which moves us on to cutting the welt.
is primarily sand, we call it a sandy soil. If the mix is primarily clay, we call it a clay soil. If the soil is a relatively equal mix of all three, containing no more than 35% clay, we call it a loam. Available moisture, inches of water per foot of soil. Soil texture, very coarse sand. Average amount, 0.5. Coarse sand, 0.7. Sandy, 1.0. Sandy loam, 1.4. Loam, 2.0. Clay loam, 2.3. Silty clay, 2.5. Clay, 2.7. Source: Fundamentals of Soil Science. Adhering water films can vary greatly in thickness, but if the water molecules adhering to a soil particle become too thick, the force of adhesion becomes too weak to resist the force of gravity, and some water flows deeper into the soil. When water films are relatively thick, the soil feels wet and plant roots can easily absorb moisture. Field capacity is the term describing soil particles holding all the water they can against the force of gravity. At the other extreme, the thinner the water films become, the more tightly they adhere and the drier the earth feels. At some degree of desiccation, roots are no longer forceful enough to draw on soil moisture as fast as the plants are transpiring. This condition is called the wilting point. The term available moisture refers to the difference between field capacity and the amount of moisture left after the plants have died. Clayey soil can provide plants with 3 times as much available water as sand, 6 times as much as a very coarse sandy soil. It might seem logical to conclude that a clayey garden would be the most drought resistant, but there's more to it.
With all the templates in order, I transfer them to leather and cut them out. I'm working with a 4 to 5 weight, leaning more towards 4. I wish I had a slightly more heavy leather, but this sheath is robust enough for the field. When cutting out the welt, punch a hole at the tip. This will prevent the leather from wanting to tear or rip at this sharp point.
Sand, 6 times as much as a very coarse sandy soil. It might seem logical to conclude that a clayey garden would be the most drought resistant, but there's more to it. For some crops, deep sandy loam can provide just about as much useful moisture as clays. Sandy soils usually allow more extensive root development, so a plant...
From here is basic leather craft skills: beveling edges, dyeing, punching holes, basic layout, and basic tools. I added a loop for a ferro rod which took some time skiving to match the welt thickness, and cut that portion of the welt out. A couple of hours of punching holes with an awl and sewing will leave your hands sore, but this is the name of the game for being handcrafted.
Drought resistant, but there's more to it. For some crops, deep sandy loam can provide just about as much useful moisture as clays. Sandy soils usually allow more extensive root development, so a plant with a naturally aggressive and deep root system may be able to occupy a much larger volume of sandy loam, ultimately coming up with more moisture than it could obtain from a heavy, airless clay. The sandy loams often have a clayey, moisture-rich subsoil. Because of this interplay of factors, how much available water your own unique garden soil is actually capable of providing and how much you will have to supplement it with irrigation can only be discovered by trial. How soil loses water. Suppose we tilled a plot about April 1st and then measured soil moisture loss until October. Because plants growing around the edge might extend roots into our test plot and extract moisture, we'll make our tilled area 50 feet by 50 feet and make all our measurements in the center. And let's locate this imaginary plot in full sun on flat, uniform soil. And let's plant absolutely nothing in this bare earth. And all season, let's rigorously hoe out every weed while it is still very tiny. Let's also suppose it's been a typical maritime northwest rainy winter, so on April 1 the soil is at field capacity, holding all the moisture it can. From early April until well into September, the hot sun will beat down on this bare plot. Our summer rains generally come in insignificant installments and do not penetrate deeply. All of the rain quickly evaporates from the surface few inches without recharging deeper layers. Most readers would reason that a soil moisture measurement taken 6 inches down on September 1st should show very little water left. 1 foot down seems like it should be just as dry, and in fact most gardeners would expect that there would be very little water found in the soil until we got down quite a few feet, if there were several feet of soil. But this is not what happens. The hot sun does dry out the surface inches, but if we dig down 6 inches or so, there will be almost as much water present in September as there was in April. Bare earth does not lose much water at all. Once a thin surface layer is completely desiccated, be it loose or compacted, virtually no further loss of moisture can occur. The only soils that continue to dry out when bare are certain kinds of very heavy clays that form deep cracks. These ever-deepening openings allow atmospheric air to freely evaporate additional moisture. But if the cracks are filled with dust by surface cultivation, even this soil type ceases to lose water. Soil functions as our bank account, holding available water in storage. In our climate, soil is inevitably charged to capacity by winter rains, but then all summer, growing plants make heavy withdrawals. But hot sun and wind working directly on soil don't remove much water. That is caused by hot sun and wind working on plant leaves, making them transpire moisture drawn from the earth through their root systems. Plants desiccate soil to the ultimate depth and lateral extent of their rooting ability, and then some. The size of vegetable root systems is greater than most gardeners would think. The amount of moisture potentially available to sustain vegetable growth is also greater than most gardeners think. Rain and irrigation are not the only ways to replace soil moisture. If the soil body is deep, water will gradually come up from below the root zone by capillarity. Capillarity works by the very same force of adhesion that makes moisture stick to a soil particle. A column of water in a vertical tube, like a thin straw, adheres to the tube's inner surfaces. This adhesion tends to lift the edges of the column of water. As the tube's diameter becomes smaller, the amount of lift becomes greater. Soil particles form interconnected pores that allow an inefficient capillary flow, recharging dry soil above. However, the drier soil becomes, the less effective capillary flow becomes. This is why a thoroughly desiccated surface layer only a few inches thick acts as a powerful mulch. Industrial farming and modern gardening tend to discount the replacement of surface moisture by capillarity, considering this flow an insignificant factor compared with the moisture needs of crops. But conventional agriculture focuses on maximized yields through high plant densities. Capillarity is too slow to support dense crop stands where numerous root systems are competing. But when a single plant can, without any competition, occupy a large enough area, moisture replacement by capillarity becomes significant. How plants obtain water. Most gardeners know that plants acquire water and minerals through their root systems, and leave it at that. But the process is not quite that simple. The actively growing tender root tips and almost microscopic root hairs close to the tip absorb most of the plant's moisture as they occupy new territory. As the root continues to extend, parts behind the tip cease to be effective because, as soil particles in direct contact with these tips and hairs dry out, the older roots thicken and develop a bark, while most of the absorbent hairs slough off. This rotation from being actively foraging tissue to becoming more passive conductive and supportive tissue is probably a survival adaptation because the slow capillary movement of soil moisture fails to replace what the plant used as fast as the plant might like. The plant is far better off to aggressively seek new water in unoccupied soil than to wait for the soil its roots already occupy to be recharged. A simple bit of old research magnificently illustrated the significance of this. A scientist named Dittmer observed in 1937 that a single potted ryegrass plant allocated only 1 cubic foot of soil to grow in made about 3 miles of new roots and root hairs every day. Ryegrasses are known to make more roots than most plants. I calculate that a cubic foot of silty soil offers about 30,000 square feet of surface area to plant roots. If 3 miles of microscopic root tips and hairs, roughly 16,000 lineal feet, draws water only from a few millimeters of surrounding soil, then that single rye plant should be able to continue ramifying into a cubic foot of silty soil and find enough water for quite a few days before wilting. These arithmetical estimates agree with my observations in the garden and with my experiences raising transplants in pots. Lowered plant density, the key to water-wise.
Once it's all sewed, I suggest wetting the sheath slightly before fitting. And be super cautious at this point because it's a heck of a lot easier to slice through a wet leather than it is a dry leather. If it fits and you are happy, saturate the leather a bit more and begin forming.
Medical estimates agree with my observations in the garden and with my experiences raising transplants in pots. Lowered plant density, the key to water-wise gardening. I always think my latest try at writing a near-perfect garden book is quite a bit better than the last. Growing vegetables west of the Cascades recommended somewhat wider spacings on raised beds than I did in 1980 because I had repeatedly noticed.
Lots of items can help to form wet leather, as long as they are smooth and a little bit bulbous. One of my favorites is a wooden hair pick.
I always think my latest try at writing a near-perfect garden book is quite a bit better than the last. Growing vegetables west of the Cascades recommended somewhat wider spacings on raised beds than I did in 1980 because I had repeatedly noticed that once a leaf canopy forms, plant growth slows markedly. Adding a little more fertilizer helps after plants bump, but still the rate of growth never equals that of younger plants. For years I assumed crowded plants stopped producing as much because competition developed for light. But now I see that unseen competition for root room also slows them down. Even if moisture is regularly recharged by irrigation, and although nutrients are replaced, once a bit of earth has been occupied by the roots of one plant, it is not so readily available to the roots of another. So allocating more elbow room allows vegetables to get larger and yield longer and allows the gardener to reduce the frequency of irrigations. Though hot baking sun and wind can desiccate the few inches of surface soil, withdrawals of moisture from greater depths are made by growing plants transpiring moisture through their leaf surfaces. The amount of water a growing crop will transpire is determined first by the nature of the species itself, then by the amount of leaf exposed to sun, air temperature, humidity, and wind. In these respects, the crop is like an automobile radiator. With cars, the more metal surfaces, the colder the ambient air.
Now down to the final punch-out, being a retaining strap and a belt loop. With this, the sheath is essentially complete, other than letting it rest a day or two before conditioning.
Nature of the species itself, then by the amount of leaf exposed to sun, air temperature, humidity, and wind. In these respects, the crop is like an automobile radiator. With cars, the more metal surfaces, the colder the ambient air, and the higher the wind speed, the better the radiator can cool. In the garden, the more leaf surfaces, the faster, warmer, and drier the wind, and the brighter the sunlight, the more water is lost through transpiration. Dealing with a surprise water shortage. Suppose you are growing a conventional, irrigated garden and something unanticipated interrupts your ability to water. Perhaps you are homesteading and your well begins to dry up. Perhaps you're a backyard gardener and the municipality temporarily restricts usage. What to do? First, if at all possible before the restrictions take effect, water very heavily and long to ensure there is maximum subsoil moisture. Then eliminate all newly started interplantings and ruthlessly hoe out at least 75% of the remaining immature plants and about half of those about 2 weeks away from harvest. For example, suppose you've got a 4-foot wide intensive bed holding 7 rows of broccoli on 12-inch centers, or about 21 plants. Remove at least every other row and every other plant in the 3 or 4 remaining rows. Try to bring plant density down to those described in Chapter 5, How to Grow It A to Z. Then shallowly hoe the soil every day or two to encourage the surface inches to dry out and form a dust mulch. You water-wise person, you're already dry gardening. Now start fertigating. How long available soil water will sustain a crop is determined by how many plants are drawing on the reserve, how extensively their root systems develop, and how many leaves are transpiring the moisture. If there are no plants, most of the water will stay unused in the barren soil through the entire growing season. If a crop canopy is...
If you made it this far, thank you for watching. I hope you gathered a tip or something of value.